Really excited to be here with all of y'all, a lot of new faces, but also really excited to hear from my friends, comrades here who, all four of them last month took some really incredible, kind of like once in a lifetime trips, and are coming to share some of what they learned from those trips. So I don't want to introduce it too much because I actually want to just give them the chance to do that. But if you didn't know already, the panel today is reporting from the Philippines. So as sort of hosting organizations, myself and Adriana are here with People Organizing for Philippine Solidarity. Rose here is from Kalikasan Solidarity Organization. Bren is from Portland Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines. And then Dan over here is from Veterans for Peace. So just quick intros. There's so much more that they could say. But yeah, what we'll do is we'll have some time for specific questions for the folks to share about their trips. And then we'll have some time for open Q&A and then time for breakout too. So yeah, let's get started. So first I actually want to direct a question directly to Bren. Could you share about the objectives for your trip to the Philippines and how they came into focus during your time in the Philippines?
Yes, absolutely. Can everyone hear me back there? Cool. I will try to project. Thank you, Sam. Like Sam mentioned, my name is Bren. And I and Dan had the opportunity to join a national peace mission last month, going to the Philippines. It was put on by Bayan US, so it was a national trip. Bayan, if you don't know, stands for Bagong Alyansang Makabayan, so New Patriotic.
Just came back from the Philippines, so.
Exactly. Almost fluent. Anyways, so we were about 30 people total, our contingent. And the objective really was, as we've been hearing about all day today, the U.S. is all over the world, really. Its military footprint is like ever expanding, including in the Philippines, where there is not a day where there is not a U.S. troop on its soil. And it really is ramping up. It is provoking war with China, and has been for the last several years. So the objectives really were for us to come to the Philippines to investigate the impacts of U.S. militarism on the people and the land of the Philippines. Really because in a lot of ways, even the Filipino people don't know what's going on. So as U.S. citizens, we could really access spaces that Filipino people cannot normally. So it took like 30 Americans to come and kind of see what was happening, to even like go into certain places and like actually just visually see what is happening, what the U.S. is doing, which hadn't been able to be done before. So just to give a little bit of background on the Philippines has always been of interest to the U.S., to large colonial powers, but it's always been of a lot of use to the U.S. It's very rich in natural resources and agricultural products, and is a source of cheap labor. And these days, the proximity of the Philippines to China has become very interesting to the U.S. The U.S. has historically had a pretty major military presence in the Philippines, pretty much since the Philippines became a colony of the U.S. in the late 1800s, in 1898. And even after it was granted nominal independence in 1946, a really significant military presence remained. In 1991, Philippine Congress voted to essentially kick out U.S. military bases based on, the will of the people. There was a growing mass movement behind that decision. But U.S. imperialism is crafty. It had to find a way to maintain its hold on the Philippines. So what it did was in 1999, the Visiting Forces Agreement, the VFA, was passed. And the VFA essentially is the legal framework that allows the U.S. to temporarily be hosted by the Philippines in Philippine military bases, right? So it's a way of saying, okay, it's not technically a U.S. base, but U.S. military personnel are allowed to use an unlimited number of bases temporarily, meaning they just have to swap out every so often, rotate the troops. But really, they are allowed to stay there for an unlimited duration of time, and they also don't have to report to the Philippine military what they're doing. So the U.S. essentially is allowed to operate with impunity in secret across the country, like to this day. And that really was the objective of our mission, to see what the realities were. And we learned so much and saw so many things, but really I think one of the big takeaways was, my group, our group, and other groups that went to other places around the country, we really actually found that there is way more U.S. military presence across the Philippines than is being reported. It actually, it is not being reported publicly what the reality is. There are so many more secret bases that are being used by the U.S. military, more than the 9 that have already been publicly, stated by the U.S. and Philippine government. But really, they are planning a lot more than they are telling all of us. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'll just remind all our panelists, we have a timekeeper here because we do want to make sure we have time for the open Q&A for everyone here to be able to participate, and also have time for our breakouts too. So if we can keep our responses to the time allotted, we'll be able to get through everything. So with that, Rose, you took a different trip last month. Could you share about why you went to Brussels, Belgium last month for the International People's Tribunal, and also just what the tribunal was?
Yeah, so I went to Brussels a few weeks ago for the International People's Tribunal, which is a tribunal that was put on by the Friends of the Filipino People in Struggle, which is an international coalition of people in solidarity with the Philippines, and then also put on in coalition with the International Alliance of Democratic Lawyers. So different progressive lawyers internationally. And yeah, I went with Adriana and multiple other people here from Portland. We had a contingent of about 10 or 11 people who went to Brussels for the tribunal. And so really the purpose of the tribunal was to elevate a lot of what the on-the-ground conditions are from the people who have been faced by war crimes and other human rights violations in the Philippines. And yeah, for the tribunal to be put on, there's sort of a long history of people's tribunals, both for the Philippines, but also other oppressed peoples. One of the first international people's tribunals was actually on Vietnam, after the U.S. war on Vietnam. And the first one in the Philippines, I believe, was in the 1980s when the Marcos Sr., the previous dictator of the Philippines who instigated martial law, was tried by the tribunal. And so now with Marcos Jr. in power, also seeing a lot of the, reflected of the same conditions of really de facto martial law in the Philippines and the U.S. militarization of the Philippines and what the effects are on the people. So really why we went is to hear from the witnesses, to be able to take part in the proceedings of the tribunal, and to elevate the calls of the witnesses. A lot of the witnesses were land defenders. Brandon Lee, the keynote speaker of this tribunal, of this summit, was actually a witness video testimony for the tribunal, documenting his case of harassment from the state and eventual assassination attempt. So we heard timeless, again and again, different stories of land defenders, indigenous peoples, peasants who were killed or murdered or harassed, communities who are bombed, and even another element is the war crimes that take place against even resistance fighters, where even after surrendering, they would be killed as prisoners of war. And so the context of the tribunal really comes about as in the context of the civil war in the Philippines. Because of all the conditions, people do take up resistance to fight, and so that is also the context of why it's considered war crimes in international law, because the Philippines is in the context of a war, so really these crimes against the people are part of the Philippine government's war, and which is directed by the United States. So yeah, really a large part of objective for our contingent from Portland is to come to events like this and to be able to report back and share about the conditions in the Philippines. And we'll get to later also the guilty verdict of the tribunal against both the current Marcos administration, previous Duterte administration, and our President Biden for supporting these war crimes directly through material support to the Philippines.
Okay, thanks so much. Great. So I think for this next question, I actually want to go over to you, Dan. If you could actually just share a little bit about your background and why it was important for you to go to the Philippines. And so really for you personally, what did this experience mean to you?
Well, just to give you a little history, I'm a Vietnam veteran. In 1968, I was deployed to Quang Tri Province in Vietnam, which is one of the areas that was highly sprayed by Agent Orange. And I had a number of situations where I had been danced with death, close calls. But I was fortunate to survive that, only to be haunted later years when my first child was born. And he was born with, Casey was born in December 16, 1977, with a number of birth defects, one being congenital heart disease, cleft palate, and Eagle-Barrett's disease, which is commonly known as prune belly. All of these things were related to Agent Orange. At the time, I had no idea what that meant. But, when he was 3 years old in 1981, he had to go for surgery. And surgery, after 10 hours, something went wrong. Casey went into a coma for 7 weeks. And I was rocking him on his last day when he took his last breath and died in my arms. Well, I know what it means to be a combat veteran. I also know what it means to be somebody who loses a child. And therefore, I understood what it meant, not just my grief, but the grief of the Vietnamese, where over millions of people had been killed and children being orphaned, etc. And the same issues are related to Palestine. The same issues, war after war after war, are the same things. I also, when I came home, I was very involved. I mean, I didn't like being in the military to begin with, but when I got out, I became a labor activist. I was very much involved in working class issues. I was also involved in the sanctuary movement for Central American refugees. So human rights issues were priority in my life. I believe that, for me, my own post-traumatic stress, my own moral injury, I needed to do something rather than just be in my own mind and just becoming more and more depressed. I had to be active in some way. I'm also was a member of an organization, Jewish organization called, God, I can't even think of the name of it. It was another organization, a women's organization, that was involved in Central American issues, but we were also, at that time, in the 1980s, supporting Palestinian rights. So years later, of course, I'm also not just, I was also a member of Jewish Voice for Peace. So these issues all relate to what was going on in the Philippines. And since I had been stationed in the Philippines for 9 months after I left Vietnam, this was a return home. This was a return to deal with my own post-traumatic stress and to visit the very place that I was stationed in, Subic Bay, Marine Corps base there. And many emotions came up at that time. And we also met a man there named Jimmy Mendoza, who had been a labor activist, who had to go underground. He was caught by the police, tortured. He told us his story of being tortured, and he survived that and became a human rights victim and won recognition from a human rights organization for his torture. He was incredible because he also took us up into the jungles that I used to have to patrol and guard ammo dumps spread throughout the jungle. It was totally different because now it is a natural habitat. It's a preserve for the trees and the animals that live in the forest and the jungles there. So that's why I went back, part of my healing process. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So next question is for Bren. Can you tell us what role U.S. interests in the region have played both historically in the state-sanctioned violence and counterinsurgency in the Philippines, and also how that's changed over the years?
Yes. I'm going to try to keep it to 5 minutes, but there's a lot of history, as you can imagine. So the U.S. has been kind of the backbone of the counterinsurgency tactics that are employed in the Philippines, and the U.S. has been for a really long time. During the 1940s and 50s, when the Philippines was being invaded by Japan, there was a guerrilla called the Hukbalahap, a People's Army against the invasion of Japan, the occupation of Japan. And the U.S. sent over military aid as well as someone called, he was an Air Force colonel, lieutenant colonel, called Lansdale. And Lansdale really is one of the fathers of counterinsurgency, and he developed a lot of his tactics and methods on the Filipino people, through the experience of trying to crush the people's resistance to, the Japanese invasion, and afterwards too, the people's resistance. So really, this kind of link between the Philippine government and counterinsurgency and U.S. counterinsurgency really has just stayed across the decades. It's a very close link that they have. What Lansdale pioneered was the use actually of psychological warfare, particular to counterinsurgency. So he was one of the people who first used the tactic of recruiting civilians from people's neighborhoods to defend and patrol their neighborhoods against their fellow neighbors who were suspected of being resistance fighters. So really sowing disunity and distrust in the communities. And I think Brandon mentioned it in his keynote address earlier, but after 9/11 happened here in the U.S., the Philippines, specifically Mindanao, the southernmost group of islands, was declared as the second front in the war on terror. And that meant that there was a joint operation, a joint U.S.-Philippine military operation called Operation Enduring Freedom, specific to the Philippines. And that, again, meant that a lot of funding and resources, training resources were released. So the U.S. came over and trained the Philippine military in counterinsurgency techniques, and brought weapons along with them. So really now the U.S. Is using the Philippines as a launching pad for its military buildup, right, against China, which they are very explicit about. The U.S. is very upfront about that fact, and that means, like I mentioned earlier, that the U.S. is pretty much everywhere across the archipelago to act as deterrence, But what we saw was that, these counterinsurgency tactics are used against the Filipino people constantly. People are red tagged for developing a community pantry in the middle of the pandemic. People are red tagged for being student journalists. One of our hosts that we talked to and integrated with, she was 18 or 19 when she was red tagged just for writing about issues in her community. It really is so embedded in the lives of so many people there. The U.S. and its counterinsurgency tactics and the way that the Philippine military has also taken that up and developed them a lot. I think every corner of the Philippines has been touched by the violence and by the increased militarization there.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Next question is actually again for Bren, but also for Rose. Maybe we can start with you, Rose.
Next one's for Dan.
Oh my God, I skipped over one question because the next question is for Dan, and we'll come back to y'all. Can you tell us what effects does U.S. military presence have on Filipino communities that they're placed in? And what are some of the effects of U.S. military presence in the Philippines that you've heard?
Well, I think one of the things, I think Bren actually really covered that really well. I would just add that, these delegations for peace is not something new for me. I've been on 2 delegations to Vietnam, once in 2006, once in 2018 for the 50th anniversary of the My Lai massacre. Also been to Jeju Island and Okinawa as the U.S. was preparing to build bases there and was involved in solidarity movements with the people opposing bases. So it's just natural that these chain of islands that are surrounding China are one of the things that has been, the game up by Pelosi actually going to Taiwan, and this pivot to Asia by the U.S. military is important. But what really affected me while I was there was actually labor activism that was going on. And we went to the Dole plantation in Mindanao. And I just want to show you what happens to somebody when they just had a dispute over water rights and land rights with the company, and they sent in thugs. So if you could show this little video, it would be great.
Yeah, we'll show the video. It's just working, right? This is why we save money for education, not for war, because this projector's really old and it's taking a long time to warm up.
Oh, here, I see it coming. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Oh, It's still warm.
Oh, that's cute.
And while you're watching this, is basically the dispute that was going on. Since he continued to present to officials their deeds and their rights, but the officials were just not paying attention. Eventually, because he pursued it, they sent the Dole Company or whoever sent these thugs to visit his family, armed thugs. And so you'll see this is a video that his family took when they arrived.
Okay, yeah, let's watch.
This vehicle of the
Here comes the homeowner.
That's the worker, the
That's
dole
the worker
worker.
homeowner, actually, former military himself. They began a physical fight.
the one who first
He's firing a weapon at him.
they wounded one
3 wounded, 1 killed.
Wife comes out. Now, if you could show the still pictures of him,
Yeah.
that'd be great.
So
The thing
this
is he survived that. And he's telling us the story, so, and showing that video. The people that committed the crime, shot him, are walking around free. They've never been arrested, and he still sees them when he's in the community with them. And they act as though nothing has happened.
It's really common for private corporations to send private security to do things like this. This is not the only story that we heard about, similar.
Right. There he is. And then the next one we'll show you. That's the hole in his head. Can you imagine that? That he survived. That's it.
Okay, yeah.
And he's a dole plantation worker that was.
No, he didn't say he was a doe plant. He was a homeowner in that area, and he had a dispute with the company over water rights.
Water rights.
And that was for the entire community, because the other gentleman came also dealing with land rights. Because these corporations are actually doing land grabs and taking the land from people for their own use. And the politicians, when they complained and even show evidence, they've basically been bought off. When I asked a lawyer dealing with some of this stuff, he basically said it's union busting, and it's to let the other developers in the world that want to come there know that they won't have a problem with the officials dealing with labor law.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think just kind of from what you're sharing, right? It's horrific, but not an isolated incident either. And so this is actually what happens to people who are asserting their right to land, to water, to things like that. So I think that's actually a good segue to the next question for Bran and Rose. If you could talk about actually how the Filipino communities that you've heard from, we'll start with you, Rose. How the Filipino communities you've heard from organize themselves against the violence and oppression of the Philippine state, and of course those who work for or closely with the Philippine state, as we saw there, and U.S. interests in the Philippines.
Yeah, so a lot of the stories from the tribunal and the witnesses who were there to share their testimony were like very much involved, just like Dan shared it, just like, yeah, like advocating for the basic rights of their communities. Like whether it's water rights, one significant example was a Lumad teacher, which is like an indigenous group in the Philippines, and under the previous Duterte administration, there was a concerted campaign by the Philippine government to shut down these like Lumad schools that the community had set up to teach like the people about their rights and like their rights to the land, their rights to water, their rights to political rights, and also just like basic things like literacy, because many of the indigenous people never see a school that actually like serves them and like enables them to have a basic education. So in this case where there's these different Lumad schools, this one teacher shared about the bombings that the government did, where they just indiscriminately bombed the Lumad schools, like acting as if they were red tagged. So that basically means that they're treated as like enemy combatants of the New People's Army, or like the revolutionary fighters, and like in fact they are just school teachers and students. And so that was one example of like the people fighting, and also just I would say like tying, like again with what Dan said with like the water and like how tied it is to like these corporations. It's like these violations really are only happening because of the economic like issues, and like both people fighting like for their like to not be in poverty, to have like basic schooling or like a right to their land, and then on the other hand for the imperialists to extract resources. A lot of the things that they talk about in the Lumad schools were fighting against mining projects because we have a right to our land, and so that's why it was a threat to the Philippine government and their U.S.-backed interests.
Thank you. Go over to you, Bran.
Yeah, if you were here for Brandon's keynote and what we just saw, really, like, it's hard to overstate the brutality of the U.S.-backed and trained AFP, even against U.S. citizens, let alone, the people of the Philippines. And in terms of resistance, there's no denying, like what Dan and I saw on our trip, there's no denying that that some organizing efforts have been really decimated in some areas because of this brutality. I'm getting a little... But what is also undeniable is that the intensification of this repression only grows the will to fight of the people. Almost every organizer that we met and integrated with was younger than us, and many of them had been in prison already, or knew people, had family members who had been murdered by the state. Almost all of them have been red tagged and live in fear for their lives. We interviewed one elder of the movement, like you mentioned, Dan, who was imprisoned and tortured under martial law, under Marcos's father, the late dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr., and immediately after this organizer was released from prison, he went right back to organizing. And he said what first politicized him initially was meeting U.S. soldiers who were stationed in the Philippines, who had been drafted to fight in Vietnam, who did not want to be there and who did not want to be killing children and innocent people, you know. And so what we do here matters. Really, standing in solidarity means something. It means a lot to the people in the Philippines. It changes the futures, the outcomes, in some cases in the Philippines. And for as long as imperialism exists, there will be resistance to it, for sure. And it is our duty here to be in solidarity with the people who face the violence of where our tax dollars are going, who face the sharp end of that stick. It is our duty here to take action for those people and alongside those people. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So now that we've heard about some of really concrete examples of the oppression and repression taking place on the ground in the Philippines, I think it'd be great to go over to Adriana and Rose. If y'all can talk on the outcome of the International People's Tribunal and how that connects to these on-the-ground stories, these concrete realities of oppression and repression, and what's the impact of that?
Yeah, so Rose shared a little bit about the tribunal. So I think all of you actually have a copy of the verdict. It's a 10-page verdict, so really encourage people to read it because it's so rich. But I'll just give you the rundown of what it is saying, which is that, in the context that Rose gave of a civil war in the Philippines, where there's people fighting for their right to self-determination and for national liberation that is actually protected under the UN Charter, Geneva Conventions, and many other international treaties. The tribunal found the Marcos, Duterte regimes, the government of the Philippines, Biden, and the US government, so all five, guilty of war crimes and violations of international humanitarian law. And the war crimes piece is something that it didn't really click to me before going to the tribunal, but literally the government of the Philippines will capture prisoners of war and not treat them humanely. They will torture them and brutalize them and kill them and do really horrendous things to their bodies and post it online. And we actually heard from Euphemia Kulamat, who found out about the death of her daughter, who was an NPA fighter, on the internet, on Facebook. So that's what war crimes really means, because when the New People's Army captures surrenderies of the government of the Republic of the Philippines, they're treated with dignity, and they're given food and medicine. So that's one finding of the tribunal. And the other, violations of humanitarian law. I mean, we just heard a lot of examples. I think that probably clicks. But really, what the tribunal means for the Filipino people is that it's an international stage to really voice the thousands of cases like this that have happened in only the past 8 years. So really, it's something that we want to continue to talk about, and that, that these international judicial organizations and people's organizations like ours, like Friends of the Filipino People in Struggle and the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, can really project this message that we don't want the Biden regime, our U.S. government, backing these war crimes. Like, it's gotten to such a escalated point. So that's really, what we learned about in the tribunal.
Yeah,
briefly.
yeah, I would just add to, like, in terms of the use of the verdict or its importance, like, both in multiple ways, but I think one of them too is, like, even what Dan shared about that Dole, in that case with the person who was advocating for water rights, and like how many other things there are like that happen all the time but like aren't documented or aren't like, so really the tribunal is a way that like to elevate these voices that would otherwise without the tribunal not be heard by so many people. So that's a huge component of it, but also that, well, like the People's Tribunal isn't like, you know, the International Criminal Court, or like this body recognized by the UN. It is based on like existing international laws that are very real, like international humanitarian law or the Geneva Convention or the Algiers Declaration that ensures that people do have the right to struggle for self-determination and for national liberation, including armed struggle. And these are things that have precedence in existing international law. And so to both elevate the witnesses in these cases that would otherwise not be heard, but also to frame that in a legal manner that can be used further in our movement to also advance the legal movement, whether that's like, you know, submitting cases to the ICC or showing the legitimacy of these crimes that they are happening. And even in the Philippines, I know after the tribunal, the findings have been circulated, and like there are efforts to educate around it too. So like even for the people in the Philippines, it's like actually a valuable resource to be able to say, hey, these war crimes are real. They are like, you know, not supposed to be happening, and there is like forms of like quantifying like why they are war crimes. So just those are some different aspects of the importance of the IPT.
Okay, thank you. Let's give a quick round of applause to our four panelists. Thank y'all so much. What an incredible opportunity we have to be able to hear from y'all, and I'm looking forward to plenty more after today too. We do have some time. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A, for just an open Q&A session. So if folks here have questions, you can just raise your hand. I can take a stack. So 5 minutes. We have 5 minutes, not 10. Thank you. Okay, well, if nobody here, you can raise your hand. Maybe I'll start us off though, because I have some questions. I think one that I would like to know is, and I think this is.
Can I interrupt just briefly? Just when you guys are done, if you would put the chairs back on the tables, that'd be
Sure.
super helpful.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I think this question actually, it is especially for the witnesses who presented at the IPT, the International People's Tribunal, but I think similarly for folks that y'all interviewed in the Philippines, what kind of risk is involved for the people who gave those testimonies or that y'all interviewed? And we can just maybe start here and go down the line.
Yeah, so a lot of what the witnesses shared when they gave their testimony was just like, especially at the end of the video testimonies, like for people who weren't able to come to Brussels, would say like, in just like the legal proceedings, like, do you wish for your testimony to be shared to the IPT? And a lot of them would share like if it helps the people, because they know that they're is a risk, especially like when they're in the Philippines of like elevating this to such a high profile.
Yeah. The risk that the witnesses were taking was like, pretty big. Like, for example, there was one witness, Haley Picayo, who is a paralegal, and she actually told us that she was expecting that when she landed back in the Philippines, she would be arrested for coming because she actually had a warrant for her arrest already out. I don't think that she was, but that's something that she like knew, and she came anyways and traveled to Europe to be able to give her testimony. But at the same time, like it, very risky to come and be part of a trial, trying your government, but also they're so supported by such a strong people's movement in the Philippines that is ready to like do quick response. But that's just an example of one of the risks.
Very similarly, we heard a lot of stories about harassment and intimidation that people have been facing for a long time. I know that the indigenous Aita people's community that we visited one day, the day after we were there, the Philippine police visited them and, was asking questions about who we were, what we talked about, where we were going next, etc. So really the surveillance that a lot of these people and communities are under who are just fighting for their basic rights is pretty significant. And the harassment goes right along with it.
In another case, again, the Dole factory, there were workers that had been laid off without cause. And when I was listening to their stories, they had tried to get back through labor law, and they had attorneys working with them. And the Dole company was just basically ignoring all their rights and stuff. So they were not able to provide for their family. So economically, they were suffering, and yet they continue to fight. Now they came to us because they felt that it was too dangerous for us to go to them and expose them. They also wouldn't allow us to film them. So we just talked. So you can see that they were taking great risks just to tell us their story. And that's when the other attorney I talked with, basically I said, well, why would Dole do this, Why would they endanger their relationship with the local communities, etc.? He said, union busting, plain and simple. And that, set a light off in my head, because I was a labor representative who went through a battle of decertification and lost my job because of my fight with the union. So this was just right in front of me, the same thing that happens here in the United States, happens anywhere in the world where corporations are. Why is the military there? To support U.S. imperialism and the corporate dominance of country after country after country. And that is what you begin to see. And the reason I asked him, I said, does that mean that not only do they intimidate the workers by this, but they also are telling the international corporations that you're free to come in, you won't have problems with the unions, we've got it all taken care of.
Yeah. Thanks, y'all. We don't have a ton of time left for this section, but I'll just open it up again. If there are folks here that have questions now that you've heard a little bit more, we have about a minute or so for open Q&A. Anyone have a burning question that they really want to ask our panelists?
Was it hard to get into the Philippines? Like, did you have to kind of go through like a lot?
Technologically. It really depended on the person. For us, it was okay, but there have been cases where there's a member of someone organizing in Europe who was coming back to visit family, and she was like detained and essentially like banned and deported from ever coming back to the Philippines. So for us this time it was okay, but who knows? Yeah.
Well, technologically though,
Yeah.
when you're going through immigration there, we were supposed to do something online. I don't have, I'm not a Luddite, but I have a little difficulty with the technology. And so I filled out something in the airplane for immigration. And when I went to there, Brent had already gone through, and because I rely on her for the technology. And all of a sudden they say, go back. Go back, what are you talking about? Language problems, everything else. So they sent me to this thing to scan on the wall and to fill out the stuff online. I kept going through it and it just did not work. And I'm panicking a little bit, What? I'm going to be stuck here. I don't know what to do.
I was panicking on the other side too. Got there.
And finally, I got a hold of somebody who tried to help me and realized that I had not scanned the Wi-Fi. I had to use Wi-Fi to get into the system to make it work. And finally I still was having a problem answering the question, and one of the guards just basically said, here, and he just answered all my questions for me. And on my way back, they wanted to go through my luggage. We had to check my luggage, and I didn't want to, but they were basically forcing me to do it. So I checked my luggage, and then when I was getting ready to get on the plane, somebody stopped me and said that they wanted my combination. They wanted to go through my luggage. Well, I had some stuff that could, I had books on Marx and Mao and there, and I could be considered subversive, and so that was a little freaky. And I actually sent some information saying I hope the lawyers can stop them from getting into my luggage. But at the same time, we didn't have any more problems. But when I got home, checked my luggage, they had gone through it. So.
Yeah, leaving was probably harder.
Yeah. I think just in the past year, though, there have been two activists from Europe, both of whom have been detained for multiple days trying to get into the Philippines just to go visit family and then deported. So it does happen for sure. So I think with that, we can move on. We have 10 minutes, not 15, thank you, for breakouts. So want to maybe just do sort of by cluster, if folks can, self-determine your clusters. The discussion question is, how can you engage in solidarity with the Philippines? So we have people in the room who are in Filipino organizations. We have non-Filipinos who are in solidarity organizations with the Philippines. We have people in other organizations. And we have, I imagine, also people who are not in organizations too. So all these different ways or sort of avenues that folks can take to engage in solidarity work with the Philippines. And I do want to also offer that this workshop actually is resolution-based. And so we want to finish this workshop by uniting on a resolution to take back to the plenary after this, which will then go into the communique and unity statement that comes out of this whole summit. So we have an opportunity to help shape that here. So please, by cluster, break yourselves out. 10 minutes, how can you engage in solidarity with the Philippines? Oh yeah. You should have come prepared with tissues though. I'm over here crying too.
Great.
Oh really?
Well, thanks for